absolute support, and that means financial support also.
Good evening. I'm Terry Freeman, president of the National Civil Rights Museum. In 2018, we commemorated the 50th anniversary of Dr. King's assassination, and we challenged the community with the theme, "Where do we go from here?" Little did we know what was lying ahead in 2020. I welcome you this evening to tonight's program, Where Do We Go From Here? To the polls. The program is hosted by Keepers of 306, a group of young people who want to preserve the legacy of Dr. King and believe in the mission of the National Civil Rights Museum. I'm sure you will find this evening's program not only enlightening, but educational and inspiring. Thank you for being with us tonight.
Good evening. My name is Tracie Chapman, and I am the chair of Keepers of 306. I first want to take this moment to say thank you to the National Civil Rights Museum for allowing us to host Where Do We Go From Here? To the polls. When we think about what has transpired just over the past few months due to years of brokenness, we have to ask ourselves, what would the agents of change of yesteryears tell us today? I am certain that they would demand that we vote. 2020 has brought to the forefront many challenges of the African American experience, be it healthcare, police brutality, an unequal judicial system, housing issues, etc. Our forefathers fought the same battles and overcame them through advocacy and policy change. Voting is a necessary step to break down systemic racism. It is a very powerful tool that we must activate to bring about change in our policies that affect our communities. Voting is our power and our voice to overcome a system of oppression that has its knee on the neck of a people.
Voting is my personal declaration to drive change. I can remember being in that age range of 18 to 24 and not really realizing or understanding the importance of voting. But as I protest and as I push for change, I realize that voting is my true way of making sure that that change actually happens.
I believe voting is the vehicle to use our voice. I believe voting is a direct opportunity to activate our interests and our opinions on issues. Sure, it's one thing to express our position via social media or at the dinner table, but to relay that perspective to the polls takes our word one step further.
Voting is important for me because when I am in the voter's line, I'm reminded of a time when they bred us with us, mating mothers with sons, daughters with fathers, and vice versa, just to increase the number of slave workers. And for me, it still makes me sick to my stomach when I think there was a time that we weren't considered humans, just numbers. And so it's very important that we get the right leaders in office, because those will be a representation of us. They'll be able to support our interests. And if we don't vote, we may end up with leaders who are a poor reflection and representative of us. And then we'll only be finding ourselves complaining until the next election. And honestly, what kind of world would that be?
I choose to vote. I choose to vote for my community. I choose to vote for the youth. I choose to vote for a future where we all can thrive. I choose to vote for parents, neighbors, and future generations. I choose to vote to use my voice to empower those who cannot vote for themselves. I choose to vote because my vote is my voice.
Voting is important because it is the foundation of our democracy. Our democracy only works if we get informed and use that information to decide who will best represent us, our families, and our interest in elected office. No matter what you believe or whom you support, it's critical that you get informed and exercise your right to vote. While it may seem like your vote doesn't matter at times, it does. Especially at the local level. I actually worked for a mayor who once won an election to the Memphis City Council by only 4 votes. 4 votes. Your one vote matters, but even more, the act of getting informed and holding our elected officials accountable at the ballot box makes a difference for you and your community.
Why it's important to vote and to be informed, an informed voter. I vote to continue the legacy of my grandmother, in particular Marion Louise Griffith, who grew up in Polk County, Jackson, Mississippi. She shared her experiences with me, being a woman in the South and not always having those privileges. And in a conversation with her one day, I told her that my college friends and I were driving from UC Irvine to come to the neighborhood to vote. And she, living around the corner from me, said, "Come and get me and we'll go together." She asked in the car if I knew who I was voting for, and I confidently told her, yes, of course, I know who I'm voting for. But when I got into the booth next to her, there was a bunch of names that I was not familiar with. I knew who I was voting for president, but I didn't know everybody else on the ballot. And so I whispered to her, to the chagrin of the poll worker, "Mama Marion, who are all these other people?" She responded graciously with that sophisticated voice of hers and said, "Well, you can just leave it blank, or you can guess who's going to control your future. Either way, use your heart, because the decisions that you make with your heart are the ones that you'll be judged for." And that stayed with me. Needless to say, on that day, I followed my heart and I only voted for the president. But ever since then, I've made sure that I've been informed every time I go to the polls.
As a mother of a little boy, I always ask myself, what can I do to protect his future? I can use my voice. The best way I can use my voice is by voting. When he understands the chaos of this world, I have comfort knowing that I used my voice this year to ensure he was protected. Go vote.
In a system that often works to suppress my voice, dilute my worth, devalue my intellect, voting is my power. Voting is my voice. Voting is my right. Voting is my say-so into how our communities are represented. It is more than a candidate with name recognition or large wallet size. It is selecting a candidate that will hear the voice of a people that have been silenced for far too long. It is our policies on education, healthcare, infrastructure for your neighborhood and mine. Voting builds a better community, state, and ultimately a greater nation.
We must vote. 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 We must vote.
Keepers of 306 present Where Do We Go From Here? To the Polls with special guest Dr. Noelle Trent, Bakari Sellers, Tracie Potts, State Senator Ramesh Akbari, Dr. Thomas Parham, Reverend Dr. Earl Fisher, and Rabbi Jonah Pesner. Joining us live with a historic perspective on today's environment is Dr. Noelle Trent, Director of Interpretation, Collections, and Education at the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, Tennessee.
Good evening, and it's a privilege to be here this evening. Today, as we talk about voting, it's been an intrinsic part of the African American experience. When we look at the country's constitution, the 3/5 clause was created so that an appropriate apportionment of the demographics of the country could be decided to figure out federal representation. Yet, Despite African American bodies being valued in the count of the population for political purposes, they could not participate in the process themselves. Today, voting feels like a privilege or an obligation that many would rather not engage with. However, the reality is that voting or suffrage was a hard-fought right. We know that as early as the 1830s, free Blacks were fighting for the right to vote or enfranchisement. Despite meeting the requirements of property ownership, many free Blacks in states throughout the country found themselves barred from voting. In 1837, a Pennsylvania Supreme Court ruled that a Black landowner, William Fogg, and other free Blacks were not eligible to vote because the founding fathers never intended Blacks to be part of the body politic, and free Blacks were not citizens according to the Constitution and the laws of the state, and therefore the laws of the state of Pennsylvania. In New England, there were free Blacks who were able to vote, but the Black population was much smaller, and so the impact and significance was reduced. This would all change after the Civil War, when slavery was abolished by the 13th Amendment, and Blacks became citizens under the 14th Amendment. But it was the 15th Amendment, and this year marks the 150th anniversary of this amendment, which granted Black men the right to vote. The story of the 15th Amendment is often misunderstood. During Reconstruction, there's this concerted effort to obtain universal suffrage, voting rights for everyone, regardless of race or gender. This was an outgrowth of the abolition movement. As the fight for policies during Reconstruction moved forward, it became clear that compromises were needed. And one of those compromises was universal suffrage. Advocates had hoped that the 14th Amendment would include a clause on universal suffrage. But as things moved forward, it became clear that there would need to be a split. And there was a division between white women and the Black community. White women had been fighting for the right to vote and felt they were overdue. However, the Black community largely believed that without the right to vote, and in this current unique moment of momentum, that they needed some sort of representation at the voting level. Furthermore, Frederick Douglass noted that Blacks, unlike women, were dragged from their homes and lynched. And in a debate session with women in the American Equal Rights Amendment Association, he said, they questioned him and said, well, what about Black women? And he said, for Black women, they were taken from their homes, raped and lynched, not because they were simply women, it was because they were Black. The split between former allies turned bitter. Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote in 1868, think of Patrick and Sambo and Hans and Young Tung, who do not know the difference between a monarchy and a republic, who never read the Declaration of Independence or Webster's spelling book, making laws for Lydia Marie Childs, Lucretia Mott, or Fanny Kimball. This statement, while jarring, affirms deeply entrenched racist and xenophobic beliefs in the inferiority of men of other ethnicities and races to white women. Ultimately, the 15th Amendment was ratified, giving Black men the vote. But its ratification did not stop other acts of disenfranchisement or voter suppression. I should note that later in 1872, the first presidential election that Black men are able to participate in, Susan B. Anthony and others actively protest their right to vote and were actually arrested at that time. Now, before the establishment of a number of policies, lynching and other acts of terror and extra-legal matters were taken to inhibit Blacks from voting. It's important to note that prior to the Progressive era, the secret ballot, where your vote was anonymous, was not common or an institutionalized practice. As documented by Ida B. Wells in her book, Southern Horrors and a Red Record, the frequency of which people who sought their suffrage and participate in the electoral process were lynched or attacked was very common. Now, in addition, other measures were created to manipulate the vote. Poll taxes, which required people to pay a tax before voting, were invoked. Grandfather clauses were later established to help ensure that poor whites could vote, by providing them an excuse from poll taxes if their grandfather could vote in 1867 or another date. The third tactic was literacy tests. Literacy tests were not an impartial practice. The person who graded it could determine whether you passed or failed, and frequently Blacks failed simply because they were Black. In 1965, an Alabama literacy test had questions like, the Constitution limits the size of the District of Columbia to, and people were required to fill in the blank. Also, what words are required by law to be on all coins and printed currency? Some states had more inane questions like, how many bubbles are in a bar of soap? And why do you want to vote? Or name other people you know who will vote. And that would put people within your own community in danger. There are also accounts of Black voters being required to recite the entire Constitution from memory. However, even if one was able to accomplish these feats, there was no guarantee you could vote. Now, I would be remiss if I did not mention the 19th Amendment, which was ratified in 1920 and provided women the right to vote. This is a significant moment for Black women because they had always advocated for the right to vote and participated in political activities and voter education throughout the country. These women understood the meaning and impact of voting for their communities. Black women understood it deeply. The ratification of the 19th Amendment changed the conversation. So where voting rights was more of them advocating for their community, now they were advocating for themselves and their community. In 1913, prior to this amendment, there was a suffrage march in Washington, D.C., where women marched down Pennsylvania Avenue attacked by attacked by white men who did not want to see them vote. There was one group of African American women who participated in the march. They were the founders of the sorority Delta Sigma Theta and were asked to march at the back of the march simply because they were Black. They were placed in the vulnerable position because they were victims. They could be victims of the assault by a rowdy crowd of men. Nevertheless, they voted because they understood what it meant. They marched because they understood they were advocating not just for the moment then, but later. In 1965, in reaction to this march from Selma to Montgomery, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act banned literacy tests and provided federal oversight in areas where 50% or less of the non-white population had not registered to vote, and allowed the Attorney General to investigate. Poll taxes were not banned in local and federal elections until 1966. This is not the end of the story. The Voting Rights Act has to be renewed continually, and its effectiveness is impacted through lawsuits and other means. For example, the Supreme Court case in 2013, Shelby County v. Holder, changed how the Voting Rights Act allowed the Attorney General and the Department of Justice to monitor these debated areas. Other tactics used today include gerrymandering, the redistricting of voting districts, a reduction in polling stations, voter ID laws, as well as not sending out information about who's on the ballot so people can be properly informed before they head to the polls. Yes, the fight for voting rights is historical, but is also very much an issue of the moment. So what does history teach us about voting? It is a right, not a privilege. It is not an option. Since the founding of this country, it has been an intrinsic part of being a citizen, and it is something that African Americans have hoped to see realized. It was achieved through sacrifice. People gave their lives. For every person we know who died advocating for voting rights, like Jimmy Lee Jackson, Reverend James Reeb, Viola Luiso, there are many others who were taken from their homes and killed or terrorized for daring to participate in the electoral process. There are people who bear the scars of their pursuits, like those who participated in Bloody Sunday, the march from Selma to Montgomery, and the tragic incident on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Finally, we must remain vigilant. Because while it may seem logical to allow everyone to express their opinion through the ballot box, forces have been continually at work to suppress the vote. It is still happening today. And you only have to look at what happened in Kentucky to know that the history that I just talked about is living and breathing in our country today. Thank you so much.
Our moderator for Where Do We Go From Here to the Polls is Tracie Potts, Senior Washington Correspondent for NBC News.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. I have already learned so much being part of this program tonight. It's important for us to know the history of why we're here and why we're trying to encourage getting people to the polls. I can tell you I was inspired by some of those powerful stories that we heard of why people vote. And by the way, I was at the museum 2 years ago in 2018 during that 50th anniversary commemoration. And I remember hearing the voices of so many community leaders really encouraging people to get involved in this process. So we want to go ahead and introduce to you our panel for tonight. We have 4 people who have spent a big chunk of their lives encouraging people to vote and talking about some of the issues and why it's so important for us to vote. So let me introduce my colleagues for tonight. Dr. Thomas Parham, he is the president of California State University, Dominguez Hills. He's an author and an educator and an inspirer of young people. And I know that you've also spent a lot of time working on social justice issues. So thank you for being here tonight.
Thanks for having me, Tracy. Good afternoon and good evening, everybody.
That's right. Good afternoon on the West Coast. Good evening,
West Coast, all the way from California.
Exactly. And thank you for joining us. We have Rabbi Jonah Pressner with us today. The rabbi is the director of the Religious Action Center on Reform Judaism. And I know that you have also spent a lot of time working on social justice issues, on healthcare campaigns, on campaigns for immigration, and we'll have a lot to contribute tonight. Thank you for being here. And then we have the Reverend Dr. Earl Fisher, who has given me permission to call him Pastor Earl tonight for purposes of this program. He is the senior pastor of Abyssinian Missionary Baptist Church and founder of Up the Vote 901. And I'm looking forward to hearing a lot more about that and your work with that.
Thank you for having me. Good to be with these wonderful people.
Thank you. Absolutely. And then finally, we have Ramesh Akbari, who is a Tennessee state senator from District 29. And I'm looking forward to hearing your voice in this conversation, because I know once we do vote and we get people in place in our legislatures, in Congress, here in Washington, where I am, it's important to then focus on the issues that affect so many of our communities, particularly communities of color. And so thank you for being here. I look forward to hearing your input on that.
Thank you. Looking forward to the conversation.
Absolutely. So let's start talking about get out the vote. You know, historically for Democrats, Election Day has been an opportunity where Democrats really drive people out to the polls. And I mean, literally, right? We do the groundwork. We drive people out to the polls. So first of all, that's going to be challenging this year because many people don't want to leave their homes because of COVID-19, and we don't really know where things are going to go. But also, what is the practical strategy going to look like to drive out that vote when a lot of people really don't want to be in crowds? Pastor Earl, let me ask you about that, because I know that's a big part of what you do.
Yeah, that is part of it. And again, thanks for putting this together, and thank you for allowing me to participate. One of the things that we forecasted was the potential of COVID-19 discouraging so many people from physically accessing the ballot box. So we tried to, in the state of Tennessee, ensure that we could do absentee ballots, whereby prior to this election cycle, absentee ballots were only accessible for a small number of people who fit a particular type of criteria. You know, we were able to file a lawsuit against the state of Tennessee that ultimately the chancellor voted or ruled that we should be able to anybody who wants to have access to an absentee ballot can now, you know, go through a website, apply for it, and then don't have to necessarily run the risk of subjecting themselves to COVID-19 or any other malady because of this particular pandemic. But I also think it's important for us to note the fact that we have not had necessarily a voter registration problem, or we have had a voter education problem, a voter engagement problem, a voter empowerment problem, and a voter turnout problem. So our efforts with Up to Vote 901, not just insofar as trying to get people access to absentee ballots, but also we've done stuff in terms of transportation and education and so on and so forth. So I think all of these things are going to be necessary in this particular election cycle, because this is something that most of us have not had to manage before.
So you brought up voting by mail, particularly based on what's happening right now. Senator Akbar, I want to pull you into the conversation, because I know here in Washington, that has been a political hot potato, right? And other places around the country as well. What are you seeing in Tennessee, and what can you share about the politics of voting by mail, and whether or not that's going to be a useful tool to drive out the vote this year?
Certainly. Unfortunately, like many things that are really good for the general public, voting by mail has been politicized. When we were in, the legislature was in session in March, we tried to pass legislation to allow no excuse absentee voting. That was shot down by the majority party. When we went back again in June to conclude our legislative session, same process. There's this fear mongering and false truths that are out there that it will cause rampant voter fraud, or that you'll have people stealing ballots and mailing them in and purchasing them from folks, and all sorts of, unseemly things. But that's simply not true. Most states, including Tennessee, have had some form of absentee ballots for decades, and we've had less than 1% fraud in 20 plus years. So unfortunately, it's a political issue, but it really is a powerful tool. We saw in Wisconsin at the very beginning of the COVID crisis in America, they refused to move their elections, and it did lead to some spreading activity. Now that you see a lot of states, particularly in the South, that seem to not be managing the COVID crisis well, the last thing we want people having to do is choose between their health and the right to exercise their right to vote. It's most important that they have access. Some people will still go vote in public, and that's fine, but you should be able to have the option. And fortunately, we have 3 branches of government. So when the executive branch and the legislative branch fail to act, the judicial branch can step in, and that's what happened in Tennessee to allow no excuse absentee voting.
Dr. Parham, I want to pull you in on this point a bit. Pastor Earl said something that the senator built on, and that was this: we don't have a problem, if I'm quoting you correctly, I'm a journalist, so I like to quote people correctly, Pastor Earl, that we don't have a problem with registration, but it's beyond that where we really need to make these efforts. And, how do we move people from being registered voters? We do registration well, right? We get people signed up. How do we move people from being registered voters to likely voters actually going out to the polls, or perhaps in this case, mailing in that ballot? And then even a step beyond that, informed voters. One of the things that I noted earlier in the personal stories that were being told, which was really powerful to me, was the lady who finally went to vote and then said, I didn't recognize anybody on the down ballot. So we have to not only get people out there, but then inform our voters. And then just a lot of people just are frustrated, and they go, well, I'm not going to vote because nothing's going to change. And you talked to me about the social contract and why people feel that way. Give me a little bit of background on that.
So two quickies on that. First of all, we've got to be able to create, I think, a level of social norming that makes voting kind of cool and okay. I mean, what's true about that, I think the pastor's correct, that one of the biggest challenges we have in the country is, particularly as people, is not simply drugs, gangs, violence, poverty, or even racism or white supremacy and the tactics that people use to prevent us from voting. For me, the biggest challenge we have is psychological, which is what I call the need for mental liberation. And it is about being able to take the shackles off people's brains. The great Algerian psychiatrist Frantz Fanon was clear when he argued that each generation out of relative obscurity must reach out and seek to fulfill its legacy or betray it. And so part of what we've got to do is to be able to instill in generations of people that what you do in voting is there is no greater act of individual agency and empowerment than being able to turn your echo into a voice and be able to express your vote in a way that you think people are going to support your particular positions. And particularly with the shape of the country is in right now, we are getting a firsthand look at why leadership matters. And what's true is that it's so profound. I think that Keepers of 306 named this about where do we go from here. And I don't want to be long, but I want to be clear that when King put out where do we go from here, remember he had come on the heels of the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65. But in 66, as he's looking on the heels of that, he's saying, not much has changed. And it's because they could impassion and get people to feel the empathy in the moment, but they weren't prepared to deal with the equality. And that's what we have to be able to get our brothers and sisters in the white community to be able to do. Young people have to understand that there's a tempo to change. And so the more frustrated we get if things aren't happening fast enough, that tends to drive people's passion down and say, why does voting matter? And that contract for reciprocal exchange that Malefi Asante talks about is the notion that if we invest a whole bunch, we expect a return on it, but we aren't prepared for the tempo that it takes to be able to yield the return that we want. On the other hand, we've got to be able to help our brothers and sisters in the white community really struggle with the notion of what is it that allows you to sit in silence at the destruction of Black lives in America and still maintain your humanity. The question is not to be able to do that. And why does voting matter? It is because the policies and practices that are embedded in the systemic racism we all want to dismantle are part and parcel of the policies that people make because we did not vote for the right people who really will put those policies in place.
And you said a mouthful, and let me pick up on one thing that you said there about people who are white, not just sitting around and saying that this isn't related to me. Let me pull in somebody who has not sat around at all, but who has been very active on these issues. Rabbi Pressner, talk to us a little bit about the importance of non-African Americans, non-people of color being a part of this effort. We're seeing it now in demonstrations a lot, but as Dr. Parham said, it goes beyond the immediate demonstrations to really affect change.
Thank you so much, Tracie, and thank you, Dr. Parham. I could not have said it better, and we hear the call and say Hineni in Hebrew, which means here we are. We are showing up for God, and we are showing up for the work. I lead a Jewish denomination that is millions and millions strong, but we are also the most diverse Jewish denomination in religious life, with nearly 1 million people who are not white. There are Black Jews, there are brown Jews, there are Asian Jews, there are Latino Jews, and. And so when we say Black Lives Matter, when we see that George Floyd was lynched, when we see Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and Mike Brown, Tamir Rice, Freddie Gray, Sandra Bland, the list goes on and on and on. When we say Black Lives Matter, we say it as a Jewish call to action along with our Christian and Muslim and other faith families. I invoke the name at this moment of Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner, because as we think about the Voting Rights Act, which, by the way, was drafted in the conference room of my own Religious Action Center in Washington, D.C., because we were the host of the Leadership Conference for Civil Rights, I invoke the names Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner, 2 white Jewish men, young men, almost boys, and a young Black man who gave their lives in Mississippi summer for the sake of voting rights, which tells the story that Dr. Parham just was trying to tell. If white people see the brutal violence of systemic racism against Black and brown bodies, if we bear witness to that and we do anything other than organize and put our own bodies on the line for the sake of our family who are under assault, then we have abdicated our own humanity. And how does that actually play out? Not just protesting, not just saying Black Lives Matter. It means investing in and organizing and mobilizing along with our partners across all kinds of lines of difference for democracy. The Voting Rights Act wasn't a partisan issue. Voting rights, democracy used to be nonpartisan. In fact, for people that don't know the history that Dr. Trent was telling, the Voting Rights Act was reauthorized until it was passed by bipartisan majorities and re-signed into law by presidents like Reagan and Bush, not just Carter and Clinton. So we need to come back together as a human American family and collectively say, if Black Lives matter, then democracy and voting matters too.
And a big part of that is what you have done and what others have done is the faith community, right? Because we know that the faith community is a huge influence in our communities, particularly our communities of color, but just in general, right, in the United States. Pastor Earl, talk to me a little bit about the role of the faith community, churches, congregations, pastors like yourself in this election.
Well, the role of faith in politics can be ubiquitous. I appreciate Rabbi Pastor. I don't want to mispronounce my brother's name. I appreciate my dear brother Rabbi describing the diverse and multifaceted nature of the faith community. Because, if you talk about one brand of faith, then, white evangelicals have been willing to support who I believe to be one of the most unethical, ignorant, arrogant, and exploitative presidents in United States history. And that same brand of faith continues to manipulate and suppress votes in local, county, and state elections. And I think too many people of faith, claim a disdain towards a federal 45, but not the 45 that are in the state houses or the governor's mansions or the mayor's offices or the city council and county commission seats and so forth. But on the other hand, I think to the broader point, a more righteous and politically astute form of faith that I would like to call Black faith is what has helped us to resist political exploitation and injustice. Black faith helped mobilize the masses in times past. Without the Black faith community, you wouldn't have the abolishment of slavery. We would not have secured the franchise for Black folks. There would not have been the passage of the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts that were mentioned earlier by Dr. Parham. And most of the rights that we see the current administration rolling back are things that were won because the faith community came together and energized, empowered, educated, and engaged their community. So my challenge to all of the faith leaders is to first and foremost get informed on the history, get engaged, organize our congregations for political empowerment. Do not get out in front if you have not been trained or taught by those countless political organizers who love Black folks, but be sure to expose your congregants and your community members to the progressive theologies and the political ideologies that help get our people free.
So there's a responsibility for education in the faith community is what I'm hearing you say.
I would say absolutely, because again, going back to the point that I tried to make earlier, registration is just step one. And I would offer a complementary perspective to one of the panelists' perspectives earlier, that the voting is really low on the totem pole of political engagement, okay? Because all you have to do is qualify to be registered, register, pray that your vote is not suppressed, and then go to the ballot box. But beyond the registration piece, what impacts the low turnout beyond the voter suppression realities, and what renders our votes so anemic is that we have not cultivated a political infrastructure, a progressive political infrastructure that educates, that engages, that empowers people. So the sister who talked earlier about walking to the ballot box and not knowing any of the other candidates other than the president, that's a dangerous space to be in. And I know people from the work that we've done who have voted in elections for 40 years and didn't even know that they could leave a spot blank. Like, it was one of our voter empowerment symposiums, and a sister who had been voting since '68 said, "Oh, Dr. Fisher, we could have left that blank." Yes. So what happens is people on both sides of the political aisle or all over the political spectrum bank on voters' ignorance. They bank on it such that all you have to do is have high name recognition, which is why people who usually have the most money and can put out the most ads end up banking the most votes, because you go into the ballot box, you don't know everybody's platform, you don't know their issues, you don't know their voting record, but you might be able to recognize their name. So we have to put together a robust voter education infrastructure. We have to fund it adequately, and we have to give people clearance and access so that they can get the information. So Up to Vote 901 is committed to empowering people by giving them more political power through education, information, and representation.
So get out and vote and know what you're voting for. And that makes a lot of sense. By the way, I want to encourage you all, please feel free to jump in. I'm pitching a few thoughts to individuals. Number one, just to make sure we include everybody in the conversation. And of course, I know a little bit about some of the work that you've done, but if I don't call your name, feel free to jump in if you so feel led. But I did want to ask you, Senator Akberry, one of the things that we know is that economics and social justice are linked, right? We can demonstrate and we can march in the streets, and certainly not to devalue that, because that has led to change, and we've seen that in our history. But it's also linked to things like better jobs, higher wages, health care. These are some of the things that you have worked on in the Tennessee legislature. Talk to me about where we are, 50 plus years after Dr. King called for that. We remember him very much for the March on Washington, and we remember him certainly, and unfortunately at the Lorraine Motel, but we also have to remember some of these things that he fought for and called for all people. You're working on that. Talk to me about where we are.
Certainly. I think last year or the year before, we had a lot of time to kind of reflect on this, but Dr. King talked about working a full-time job and still being paid poverty wages, still qualifying for government assistance. Right now, we find ourselves in a situation where so many of those across the country, and I'll just use Tennessee as an example, work full-time jobs. The working poor, they do not have insurance. They are one health crisis, one accident away from bankruptcy. We have the tools to expand Medicaid in this state, and the powers that be, the majority party, has decided that's not something that's important. Literally turning away billions of dollars in federal funds, and really damaging people from urban and rural areas not being able to get preventative care. And certainly in this current health crisis, it's even more important. We don't have a minimum wage in Tennessee. We yield to the federal minimum wage. I would challenge anyone to be able to live a full and robust life of working 40 hours a week on minimum wage. It's a poverty wage. You can work your entire 40 hours and still qualify for public assistance. So we're in a difficult place. I do think, though, from this place that we're in, there's hope, right? If you look at a lot of the mayors who were elected in the last couple of years, from Atlanta to Charlotte to North Carolina, to New Orleans to San Francisco, you see these Black women who are in charge, from Jackson, Mississippi, where you have a progressive who's the mayor. Look at Birmingham. These are big situations where you have opportunities for change on a local level. Look at Stacey Abrams in her election in Georgia. We had a real opportunity there to get a true a Democrat, a Black woman at the table who really understood those issues. I think the problem is, too often our districts are gerrymandered, especially in Tennessee, where it's impossible for those who have more progressive ideas to really kind of to take the majority party, to take them out, to push these ideas. But I will say this, in the midst of the COVID crisis, in the midst of the awakening, the crying out through George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, I think that people are saying enough is enough. Look at the election in Kentucky with Charles Booker. I mean, he was outspent, but he came in and almost took that election, running on progressive ideas like a living wage, like health care for all. These are all important things that people want and demand. And I think the more that they go out and vote and raise their voices and they're protesting, it's a combination of all of it. You protest, you also have policy. You have policy, you also vote. If you don't like the person who's in office, get them out of there. Hold them accountable. Run yourself. And I think we've seen that with progressive district attorneys, where we've had cities where folks have been not prosecuted. Police brutality has not been prosecuted. We look at, on our federal level, how our Justice Department has been gutted. These elections matter. And if we really want to see progressive policies that help people be put into place, we're going to have to vote, and we're going to have an elected body that represents and truly represents the people.
Let's talk about, you mentioned George Floyd, and we know, and I certainly want to say respectfully that he is not the first or not the only person, but he certainly is someone who has touched a nerve in this country because of that 8 minutes and 46 seconds that we all saw. Talk to me, each of you. I'd like to ask each of you what you think the George Floyd impact will be on this election.
I think that, echoing what my dear Senator Ackberry said, the demonstrations that we see now, the protests that we see happening, not just all over the state of Tennessee or all over the United States, but all over the world, does signal an opportunity for us to re-envision what our political infrastructure looks like and can ultimately be. My concern is that we are being unrealistic insofar as thinking that the people who are listening now are going to continue to listen for the foreseeable future. That's not what history has shown us. Dr. Parham was bringing up Dr. King and the civil rights movement and the civil rights legislation. You know, a lot of that stuff and a lot of the black wave of activism and political engagement lasted for a relatively short window, if you look at it in the grand scheme of things. And I just believe that this should not be the time that we suffer from political pragmatism and this fear that you can't ask for too much too soon, what Dr. King once called the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. No, these types of things have infected the political infrastructure such that even when we have increased engagement, we ultimately don't seem to know what to ask for. So what I hope the George Floyd's death, Breonna Taylor's death, let's make sure we call her name, Ahmaud Arbery's death, you know, the countless other deaths have done is not just ramp up interest and excitement or celebrity desire, if you will, but this deep, long-seated engagement. I did this thing this past Sunday at my church, just saying, okay, after we protest, which is something I've been actively involved in, helped to plan and all of that, and I sanctify, we also have to commit our protest to a broader political program and project that empowers people. So that's what I'm hopeful we can ultimately end up seeing, because I've seen some of the same things happen in times past. I mean, 2012 is not too far removed. That was the start of the Black Lives Matter movement. And then in 2014 with Mike Brown, so on and so forth. So I hope we can find a sustainable form of engagement that would extend even beyond the ballot box.
Rabbi Pezner, I see you nodding your head that this needs to be a movement, not a moment in history when we look back, say, in a decade?
Amen. A movement, not a moment. Couldn't have said it better. And I will speak as a person who hangs around a lot in white folk community as much as I hang around the black and brown community. I do see something different at this moment. That 8.5 minutes of brutal lynching woke people up in a way that I think is different and is a call to action that if we organize and we mobilize and we channel, can turn into a movement, not a moment. I would just lift up one example, which is the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, led by my teacher, Reverend William Barber, who has breathed new life to the Poor People's Campaign that was originally started by Dr. King in the spirit of where do we go from here. And Dr. Barber's whole intention is to be about movement building and to be about long-term sustainable action together in a fusion movement of white people, black people, brown people, people across the religious spectrum, bringing together the whole human family in a sustainable movement of change that fuses the reality of economic oppression with racial oppression as well. So I feel like if we do our work now, we can harness this energy into a movement, not just have it be a moment.
Which is absolutely.
Go ahead, Dr. Parham. I just got word we've got a couple more minutes, but please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I was going to say, I absolutely agree with my panelists, but I think the George Floyd movement is not only symbolic for the kind of foot on the neck and knee on the neck that Black folk have been catching for so many years, but also it serves as an emotional rallying cry for people to want to get out and do something. But as the Reverend said, as the Senator said, as the Rabbi said, we've got to be able to have a targeted plan. What we want and where do we go from here was fundamentally about was the challenge to acquire power and not programs. And what we need in the country is really economic, political, educational, housing, social, healthcare. We need power to impact those programs that basically elevate people's rightful place to rulership and mastery over their circumstance, and not simply settle for a program here or there that look more like trinkets in the moment, but don't have really lasting and substantial change that we need to be able to create. And so when you think about where do we go from here, it ended with a question of chaos or community. And the chaos, of course, in that case was either do we go with violent co-annihilation, where everybody is kind of continuing to fight each other, or do we come together and build coalitions across the demographic boundaries to create this resistance movement that allows us to create the structural change and dismantle the structural inequities that are so pervasive in society, and in fact stamp out, I think as the good Reverend said, so much of the cultural ignorance that is so pervasive in the world about where do we go from here in that space.
I am going to wrap by asking each of you one question. And I am a big fan. I do a lot of training in different spaces, family engagement, education, news literacy, issues like this. And one of the things that I always say is nobody needs to come to a workshop or a forum and not be able to walk away with something tangible that they can do. And so my question to each of you, this is your speed round at the end, okay, is what one thing can people who are listening walk away and do to have an impact on, where do we go from here, getting us to the polls? What can we do to actually impact that change that you've been talking about?
Well, I'll start. I'll say jump in with both feet, whether you're running for office, supporting a candidate, or voting. That's the only way that you can really make the changes you want to see. The type of pressure that's been created around this movement, it's not just a moment. Mississippi is taking down the Confederate flag. St. Louis is closing the workhouse. These are major structural changes that people just didn't want to do. So jump in, be there, be a part of it. Understand you might not be the person at the front, but you know what? Ella Baker wasn't at the front, and she did a damn good job of moving the movement forward. So just consider that.
Thank you. Pastor Earl?
Yeah, I would simply say organize. I think much of what we just heard Senator Agberry say is not just a byproduct of people walking up to a voting booth and casting a vote. That is important and necessary, but it is connected to an organizational infrastructure. So whatever it is that you are passionate about, go and do your research, see how it has been done before. I would also recommend that you start local, but organize.
Rabbi Pessner?
Get proximate. It's not enough just to become engaged in the election and civic engagement and do voter turnout and to drive participation. We got to get proximate. We got to get in relationship deeply at the grassroots level with people who do not look like us, people who do not talk like us. We got to have black, brown, white people across the spectrum coming together and doing this work together, embodying the divine notion that every human is created in God's image. And if we come together in civic participation and engagement, then not only can we reclaim democracy and get people to the polls, we can also redeem the human family. So let's get proximate with one another.
Dr. Parham, you get the last word.
I love all those. I would say that one, you want to be civically engaged, and whatever you can do to get civically engaged and get motivated, I think you want to do. Secondly, you want to be able to encourage folk to vote, because we cannot take this for granted, which is the same thing we did, I think, in the last election. I come from the California State University, the largest system of public higher education in all of America. And as I bring you greetings, we have been engaged in trying to get our students out to get registered and encourage them to be able to vote. So you got to be civically engaged. And lastly, I would say that I always like to measure progress and not just leave it in some kind of nebulous stratosphere somewhere. So I would invite our listeners to think about creating and set up a matrix that gauges measurable progress towards achieving specific goals. And whether that's in registering folk to vote, getting civically engaged, advocating for something else, we have to try to turn our echoes into legitimate, authentic voices that fundamentally change the nature of people's lives and empower people to know that what they do in any activity makes a difference. One person stood up with a tank in Tiananmen Square. One person sat down on a bus. One person spoke out in the voice of Dr. King and others. One person can make a difference, and we've got to empower our people to be able to believe that as well.
Thank you. And I want to thank each of you for your time and for your engagement, because each of you are engaged in the communities where you are, whether it's your local, whether it's your state, nationally, those communities are better for the voice that you brought to it. And so I want to thank you for that. I also want to encourage people to do exactly what our panelists have said. Get engaged, jump in feet first. One of the first things you can do is go to vote.org and learn how you can register, where your polling locations are, whether mail-in voting is available in the area where you are, and research those candidates as we talked about. So thank you all for taking time tonight to contribute to this discussion. I appreciate it. And we are now going to turn over the next part of our conversation tonight to Bakari Sellers, an attorney, author, and CNN analyst, and a former South Carolina state representative.
Thank you, Tracie.
Here to discuss civic engagement is CNN analyst, attorney, author, and former South Carolina State Representative Bakari Sellers.
He's muted.
There we go. I was muted for a second. So first of all, let me just say thank you for having me, and I need to apologize before we get started because I have 18-month-old twins, Sadie and Stokely, who you may hear in the background. So that is my early apology. But this is an honor to be with you guys, and I listened to the panel, and it was just so robust and so profound. That it's very difficult to come after them. But I do want to add just a couple of words. I know that people talk about the psychological chains or bondage that people of color may be under or find themselves bound by. But I wanted to just take a step back and remind us as we quote King, as we quote Benjamin Mays, as we quote Baldwin, how we got to where we are. Civic engagement in this country is a fairly interesting concept. And the reason that I call it interesting is because I go back to 1955, where we had a young Black boy by the name of Emmett Till who allegedly whistled at Carolyn Bryant, and he was brutally beaten and thrown in the bottom of the Mississippi River. And his mother, Mamie Till, is referred to by many, including my father, as the strongest person in the civil rights movement. Her strength came from the fact that she had an open casket, that she allowed the world to see what racism and bigotry and hate and oppression had done to her son. You know, the world saw those things, and we missed that moment. And then we actually talked about the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And as I was listening to the speaker prior to the panel, when you think about the Edmund Pettus Bridge, it was the first time that the country had seen with their own eyes at evening news, people being beaten, the water hoses and the dogs that were placed upon Black folk in this country. And then you had the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act, and then you had the assassination of King. And when we think about this, I'm reminded that people refer to 1968. Tom Brokaw wrote a book. It was entitled Boom 1968. And the reason he called it Boom was because we had the Orangeburg Massacre, which many people don't talk about, ironically enough. I have my South Carolina State sweatshirt on tonight. And when you think about February 8th of 68 with the Orangeburg Massacre, and then you think about April 4th, the assassination of King, and then you think about June, the assassination of RFK, and you had soldiers coming back home from war, you realize that the country in 68 was becoming untethered. But again, we had that moment where we thought things may be changing. And then just 5 years ago, to fast forward, we just celebrated I don't know if the word is celebrate or commemorate or memorialize. I get tripped up over that. But we remember when Barack Obama, although he was off key, sang Amazing Grace for during the eulogy of my good friend Clemente Pinckney. And so I'm not sure per se if there is some mental bondage that people of color are under, and that is the primary concern we have in our communities. In fact, I would reject that notion out of hand and say that the primary concern that we have in this country is stopping the brutality and stopping the systemic institutionalized racism that's persecuted people of color for 401 years. That involvement requires this civic engagement that we're talking about. But I also want to be extremely clear, and I think we can be extremely clear here. When King, I honestly think Where Do We Go From Here was his second best piece of writing. And if y'all think that I Have a Dream speech was his first best piece of writing, we can fight later. But his first best piece of writing was a letter from the Birmingham jail. The second best piece was Where Do We Go From Here? And Chaos or Community were his two very binary choices that he gave us. But I want to be clear to the fact that it's never the protest. It's never been the protest. It's never been the riot. It's never been the looting that's led to the change that we've had in this country. And again, I want to be deliberate in my thought, because every ounce of change we've had in this country, from the 64-65 Voting Rights Act and Civil Rights Act to the Fair Housing Act, which was signed in 68 after King was assassinated, to the Confederate flag coming down in South Carolina, has all been because of Black blood in the streets. We're going to have police reform this year because of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, David McAtee, Rashard Brooks. The Confederate flag came down because of 9 people who were murdered in a church. The Fair Housing Act was signed because King was assassinated. 64 and 65 happened because of the brutality that people were able to see with their own eyes that people of color were going through. And so when we talk about civic engagement, for me, it's about breaking the cycle. And I think voting is one of those things, but even more importantly, to go to what is the I Have a Dream speech, which I just say it wasn't his first or second, but we get caught up in the rhythmic cadence of I have a dream that one day we shall, but we forget about the most important part of that speech, in which he talks about the fierce urgency of now. And I agree with my brother from Abyssinian that, you know, voting is of great import, but we have to demand change now. And so that engagement, it starts on a very grassroots level. That engagement, it looks like the activism of Marion Barry. It looks like the activism of Ella Baker. It looks like the activism of Julian Bond. You know, as a child of the movement, that is my perspective. That is how I see the lens of life, culturally, politically, socially, etc. And so that is what civic engagement looks like. It looks like organizing with cold pizza. It looks like making sure that you're on a cell phone in a church basement, calling people to come out, calling people to make sure that they understand the issues of the day in the particular community that you represent. It means going to school board meetings. It means going to city council meetings. It means writing your own story or your own books. It means making sure that we're sharing our pain, making sure that we're sharing our perseverance. And so, yeah, I understand and I hear when people say that there may be other issues that are affecting our community, but I think we have to be clear how far we've come. You know, in order to get to the second question, which is where do we go from here? The first question really is how far have we come? And I think that question deserves some analysis as well, especially when we're talking about civic engagement. We can talk about community organizing. We can talk about grassroots engagement. We can talk about all of these things, but the most important thing we can do is learn from those people who have come before us, who've transformed and reimagined what America should be. The most qualified person ever run for president of the United States is Hillary Clinton. Controversial, sensationalized, I know, but she was. But there wouldn't even be a Hillary Clinton. There wouldn't be any of those things if there wasn't a Shirley Chisholm. There wouldn't even be a Shirley Chisholm if it wasn't an Ella Baker and a Fannie Lou Hamer. And so we have to build on the work of all of those heroes and sheroes that have come before. We have to acknowledge them. We have to recognize the progress we've made and understand that although we've made progress, we still have yet a ways to go. And then the way to truly be engaged is we need to take off of our suits and take off our ties and take off our scrubs. And we need to do more listening. We need to meet people where they are, because the reason people are not involved in this process right now is not simply because they don't understand the value or the import of the vote. I think that is not true of the plight of many people of color in this country, but they haven't seen a system that works for them. And so they feel no purpose in participating in that system. And so sometimes we just, as we're being engaged, I think we talk too much. We don't listen enough. And so I think the first thing we need to do as we're talking about engaging civically, especially with an august body like this, especially as we're going through times as we are, sometimes we just need to shut up and listen. That's actually the first thing that we should do. We should meet people where they are and listen to the pain of their story. We can learn something. And then we can help them get involved. You know, we have a really weird sense of leadership, and I'll wrap up on these 2 points because I know that the panel, I believe, is coming back in to answer some questions. But there are a couple of points that I wanted to make before I close. And there are 2 points. One is we have a really weird sense of leadership and understanding what that is. We believe leadership is having followers or parishioners or having people who we influence. And that's not what leadership is. As we're talking about civic engagement, we need to understand what the definition of leadership is. Leadership means, or leadership begets other leaders. It means creating other people around you who then can go back and be leaders in their own right. It doesn't mean you're not a leader if you have 1,000 followers. You're a leader if you create 10 other leaders. That's first. And the second thing is we have this really weird Messiah complex. And I think it's because of the way that we've been taught, maybe, that we're just waiting on a next Martin, Malcolm, or Rosa. When the fact is that we wouldn't be here without a Foreman, a Bond, a Barry, a Baker, a Cleveland Sellers. And so I empower all of us to understand the leadership that's within us. I empower all of us to understand the fierce urgency of now, to dream with our eyes open, to go out and be the change you want to see. And then and only then can we create this new America and reimagine America in our image. And with that, I believe the panel is coming back on, and I will join them for a few moments.
Thank you. We appreciate those inspiring words and words of action. And that's what we were talking about earlier, that we really need to take the next step beyond getting people out to vote, beyond talking. I think the way you put it, and I saw someone on social media responding, less talking, more listening. And I think a lot of people would also say less talking and more action. Be the change is the way some people are responding. So we've got some questions from people who've been watching, and we want to address those because people have taken their time to participate tonight, and we want to be responsive to that. So the first one is about something that you brought up, Pastor Earl, Breonna Taylor. We don't want to forget to mention her name. And actually, I was talking with someone recently about doing some writing on this. The question is, for Breonna Taylor, what more can we do? The protests have been strong. The support has been strong. How can we push equally for Black women to be elevated when they're killed by police brutality to the same strength as our brothers?
Man, that's a complicated question because the particulars of what happened to our dear sister is not exactly the same as what happened to some of the counterparts. Insofar as like the no-knock warrant stuff that you hear people talking about, like that was that situation. They came into her house. There was actually a gun, a legal firearm. She was not the target. All of that stuff may convolute the effort a little bit. But what I think is also important, which, and I hope I am not committing a sin by diverting away from the gender difference, which is valuable. But the legislative difference is palpable because in Minnesota, you have a mayor who is identified as quote unquote liberal or progressive. You have, Brother Ellison, who was the attorney in the area. You know what I'm saying? So you don't have that stuff in Louisville. Same thing in Memphis, Tennessee. Like there are situations that happen, And I was listening to, again, my Senator Agberry talk about these wonderful Black women who were elected to office in the last thrust. You know what I'm saying? Progressive women, civic-minded women, strong, qualified, robust women. You couldn't say that in Memphis. You just couldn't. And even now, when you start talking about what's happening at the state level. So these things, and I think Brother Bakari is pointing to this, these things are connected to legislative bodies that unless you have, going back to the point that I made about organizing, unless you have a robust infrastructure, then even when the protests happen, even when the fires fall, if you will, if you don't have people in office that can pass legislation that can get more progressive policies enacted, then you'll run into these stonewalls. So I'm hoping that the folks in Louisville continue to maintain that same fervor, because again, until you commit to this stuff long term, you know, these one-offs or these five-offs sometimes just don't get it done.
Senator Ackberry, can I pull you into this because you are a woman, you serve in the legislature, and I do want to get very specifically to the heart of this question because it's not the first time I've heard it, and it certainly is no disrespect to George Floyd, to any of the men who have suffered at the hands of police, but are women getting the short stick here? Are we not giving enough attention to women who, as the pastor said, the circumstances of this may have been different, but are we seeing those names? Are we seeing those protests to the same level? And if not, what do we do about that?
Well, I do think that there is a movement to get justice for Breonna Taylor. I do agree with Pastor Earl that the elected officials in Kentucky have made the difference. And that's why it truly is important to not just focus on your presidential elections, but also on your district attorney, your states where you have your elected attorney generals. Those are important. But I think that this moment, or at least the election before this, has been really transformative for Black women. You think with the Doug Jones situation where Black women powered him to the Senate. And then coming from that in Tennessee in 2018, there were 25 Black women that were elected to office. For the first time ever, there are 3 Black women in the Tennessee State Senate. We make up the majority of the Democratic caucus, which is more of a slight on how small our caucus is. But I do think that our voices are being heard. But Zora Neale Hurston has said something to the effect that Black women are the mule of the world. We carry the burden. We are branded as strong, but we need support too. Our lives have value too. And I don't think that it's become this George Floyd or Breonna moment. I think it's George Floyd and Breonna. We have to rise to the occasion to make sure that those officers are prosecuted. And I'll say this also, that's why it's important who you elect on a federal level, because there are mechanisms that could be in place at the Department of Justice that are not right now, that make it very difficult for police-involved shootings to be prosecuted by the feds as a backstop. If you look at the Mike Brown situation in Ferguson, there was an investigation, but there was no sort of prosecution. And that is because of the required level of burden of proof that is in place at the Department of Justice on a federal level. So until we address those things in a meaningful way, it's going to be very difficult to really address this police brutality, and certainly qualified immunity. I mean, we can all talk about that all day, that has to be revamped and reviewed, and frankly, I'd love it to be tossed out the window, but I think at least if it can be revamped, will be a long way.
And as we know, all those things are kind of sitting in limbo here in the building behind me, or the building pictured behind me. This is one of the things that I cover often in Washington, the fact that, rolling back or addressing or revising or revisiting qualified immunity is something that's on the table, but not really moving toward action yet. Making changes in the Justice Department to make it easier to investigate and to prosecute when there is misconduct in local police departments, that is on the table, but the table doesn't seem to be moving very quickly. And I think that maybe you guys took a sneak peek at the second question that came in, because it talks about infrastructure and specific to Memphis and Tennessee. The history of Memphis has shown a stalemate of progress to tolerate demands to be made and heard, but not implemented, especially around police reform. How can we turn the elevated engagement into providing entry points for deep-seated infrastructure. Anyone like to address that?
Go ahead, Bakari. I'm sure you can.
Man, I'm not about to get involved in no local politics over there in Memphis and Funky Town.
They're very wise.
How about Dr. Parham? He's way out in California, so he can address that one and not have to see anybody walking down the street.
Let me just comment real.
I'm gonna try to walk a thin line and stay in my lane here in California. But two things I think I want to say. That one of the things I argued earlier is that what we have to be able to do in any movement is guard against the complacency of the folk in power who now feel suddenly, awakened to the destruction of Black lives. And also, I think the disappointment that sometimes we feel in the Black community at the pace of progress that isn't changing. Because there's a difference to me between the empathy of the moment where people feel something, in their heart and in their spirit, and the equality that they're prepared to argue for that really creates the systemic change that we're looking for. And I think Memphis or wherever you are in the country really has to go with that. But I also want to make sure that we double back on the point I think that you raised about elevating the names of Black women in the struggle, because some of that I think does not get the national attention, quite frankly, that it deserves. In the same way that the Mike Browns, whatever, and I agree with Senator Berry that it is not a function of either or, it really is a both and that we have to make sure that we are valuing Black women's lives and holding them up in the same way that we do the males in our lives. In Los Angeles, for example, we remember Latasha Harlings. Not long ago, the great intellect Kimberly Crenshaw wrote a piece that really helped with a group to really author that Say Her Name movement that is really trying to bring awareness to the fact that there are so many other Black women catching hell in the same way that men are, that we have to really promote that as well. So we want to make sure we keep that in the forefront and be able to try to move toward creating the systemic change we all want to see.
Bakari, I'm sorry, I think I cut you off earlier.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say that when you're talking about creating this systemic change, and my grandfather was actually a pastor in Memphis, Tennessee. The Reverend E.W. Williamson was at Olivet over there before the Whalums, and I have family out in Germantown, so I do know a little bit about the politics of Funky Town, of Memphis. They lived in Orange Mound. And so regardless of where you are, we have to understand a couple of things. One is that leadership comes from young people, that every ounce of change we've ever had in this country has been ushered in and led by young people, from the civil rights movement to the gay rights movement to the women's rights movement. All these movements have been led by young people. So that's first. Second, and this is no disrespect to my pastor or my senator down here, because I'm the best type of legislator. I'm retired, a retired legislator is the best type of legislator. But in Black politics and Black clergy, we have a very difficult problem of cultivating a succession plan, of bringing in new leadership. And when you're trying to usher in the change that this question centers around, most, and this is just how this is human nature. Most people are frozen in their formative years, right? So, I probably at 35 years old will be frozen in 10, 15 years from now. Will be frozen in the year 2018, 2016, 2020, et cetera. Whereas there are a lot of people who were frozen in the early to mid 90s, the late 80s, et cetera, in their thought process. And that is why we have to make sure that we continue to allow young people the opportunity to lead, because if you're 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, it's insulting to say that these are the leaders of tomorrow. And Dr. Parham deals with this every day. They're not the leaders of tomorrow. They're the leaders of right now. And so we have to make sure that we are allowing them the opportunities to lead.
Yeah, and I think Brother Sellers says that so well about change has really come on the backs of young people, not only because they have the energy, but they have the enthusiasm, but also I think there's a more fundamental question that really speaks to the whole psychology of civic engagement and protest, and that when you are young and coming up, you're in that space where we used to say on the streets where I ain't got nothing to lose. And so you feel like, there's not much I need to sacrifice. Well, the challenge is not that most communities don't know what to do. The problem is, what are they prepared to sacrifice in order to achieve the goals they want? Yeah. Because the more you get status and the more you get privilege and the more you get position and the more you get title, all that becomes a risk the older you get. And so for young people who haven't acquired all those things, they aren't as intoxicated with those kind of spaces as some of the folk in our age groups are. And so we've got to be able to do that. The question is not sometimes, do we know what the right thing to do is? The question is, what are we prepared to sacrifice?
Yes.
And if we're prepared to make those sacrifices in order to achieve the gains that we all claim that we really want.
So I have to hop in here and do the thing that they pay me to do on TV every day, which is rap.
I thought you were going with commercial break. We just getting started.
I know we're just getting started, right? We'll have an after party on this later. But I want to thank all of you, not only for your time, but for your wisdom. And for your inspiration, really. And I'm seeing in the comments from people who are watching that others feel the same way. So thank you. And really, I think all of us want to issue a call to action to those of you who are out there watching. We talked about that earlier. Be the change you want to see. Go to vote.org and figure out how to do it between now and November 3rd. So thank you all very much. Thank you for taking your time this evening.
Thank you. God bless. Take care.
A poem for today. A poem for today. A bullet can kill a man, but only apathy can kill a dream. A thing that ends with a dream is a thing unfilled, unfinished, and untold, and here is where we are. Awake after a long night of slumber, a fitful sleep rocking back and forth on the Amistad, visions of arms shaped like machetes slicing sugarcane, fingers calloused and red with cotton, palms brown with tobacco, sleeping on stomachs to keep off the healing whip scars, sleeping on backs to rub hungry bellies. We rubbed the Jim Crow from our eyes and saw a new day dawning. A sunrise so gentle that we believed it missed, thought it ghost, a great sleep we were in, with dreams folding into dreams, us folding into ourselves, all those inventions with our blood, sweat, and tears in them, all those buildings with signs marked not for you, you in back, you up top, you round the back, you stay put, what a slumber. But it takes a lot of sleep when you know you have a lot of work ahead of you. Now we awake. After such a starless midnight, on the brink of great fulfillment, now we awake, willing to take the stance that is not popular or safe or burdened with politics, but is the stance of a clear conscience. Now we awake, accepting that peaceful ends must be pursued through peaceful means. And no, that does not mean kowtow, does not mean step and fetch, it means peace. Peace like you can't hold up two fingers and still make a fist. Peace like mama standing on the front porch, your church belt hanging casually from her neck as she watched to see if you make it home before the streetlights come on. Weren't her arms folded across her bosom justice, her patient eyes faith? Wasn't that belt in the heart it covered peace? Isn't that us now? Now that we've been nudged awake, love in our hearts but a belt in our hands, offering the world our love by any means necessary. The heart screams you didn't understand last night, but the belt whispers you gon' learn today. And the foolish exclaim, where's there left to go? They say we got corner store and conglomerates, we got barefoot and shoe deals, we got nickel bag and museum swag, we got car now, garage and everything, 401k who, full medical what, stop auction money markets, we ain't Black Wall Street and we ain't shucking and jiving, we done moved up more Jeffersons in good time, and I say, but didn't a man sit in jail and say freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor, it must be demanded by the oppressed? So when they insist on another conversation about a dream, I say, hasn't it been deferred long enough? Haven't enough rivers run red with our blood to drown Langston? Haven't our black been the hue of enough blues? So now we demand a living dream, a shared dream, an oppression-free dream. We wake up and they ask, where do we go from here? And we answer, wherever in the hell we choose to. Where love leads, where love takes, where love talks, walks, and breathes. We go into Ferguson and Florida with love leading the way. We go into Detroit and Flint with love. We go into Texas, to Los Angeles, and to Chicago. We go into our local communities with eyes wide open and love spilling from our mouths like a many-tongued prayer, like a warning, like a threat. We go with black women in political positions in Atlanta and Charlotte. We go forward with names like Keisha and Val, with if you can learn to say Schwarzenegger, then you can learn to fit Orike Ogunbowale into your mouths. We go like an X across our chest, Wakanda forever. Love in our heart for the colony and colonizer, for the citizen and country. Like Coretta raising children after the dream was paused because a woman's work is never done. Like now that we awake, there's work to do. In our schools, there are living dreams to plant. In our churches, there are living dreams to plant. In our homes, there are living dreams to plant. In our lives, there's been an awakening. A drum growing louder over time, an alarm clock that sounds like Florida Evans bellowing, damn, 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 James, we must learn to live together as brothers or perish as fools. I don't believe our mamas raised any fools, did they, Memphis? So what do we do now? We go forward into tomorrow together, seeing each other's problems as our own. Your pain, mine, my loss is yours. If one of us can rise, we all can. But if one of us falls, then we all have failed. We need more than superheroes, we need you. We need more than dreamers, we need doers. We go now towards the morning light of work, ready to roll up our sleeves and do what needs to be done for all people to succeed. The bell rung isn't the end, it's the signal to clock in. Come out of your corner swinging, to get on your mark, to get yourself set in the name of peace, justice, and faith. Today we go, and we go.